Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you on our latest Thursday podcast. Today, we're doing a bit of a Marvel team-up style because I've got a guest who runs his own podcast as well, Nick Day from JGA Recruitment. Nick, how you doing? You all right?
I'm good. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Excited at the concept of a Marvel team-up style.
Excited by Marvel team-up style. Excited by the fact you're going to throw some questions at me that are going to be completely out of my comfort zone, probably going to make me think on my feet. So yeah, let's see where it goes.
We're going to get Nick to talk about himself and his background. If any of you guys, you probably have, but if you haven't heard of Nick or JGA Recruitment, I'll get him to do a bit of a background in a moment. We've also got Chris Kirby joining us. Chris, you all right?
I'm good, thanks, Chris. Happy to be here as always.
Yeah, great to have you on, mate. Great to have you on. Now, we are going to be talking today, gents, about how to build the perfect future payroll superstar. This is a conversation that Chris Kirby and I had a number of months ago, and we've also floated the idea with Nick. And if you haven't heard of JJ Recruitment, you'll get a bit of an intel as to why we'd asked someone like Nick to come on the show. But before we get him to do a little bit about himself, we're going to ask a fundamentally different question. And if this is the first time that you've listened to this podcast, the fundamentally different question is completely non-HR or payroll related. I like to really mix it up with my guests and put them on the spot. I'll go first with the answer to give you guys some time to compose yourselves. I've just read an article about a chap who in Detroit had loaned out a book from his local library, 1974, I think it was. So this being 50 years since the return due date that he was supposed to return it to, he decided to take it back into the library, from which they promptly told him, you can keep the book. We don't even have it on our records anymore. So my question is, if there was something that you could borrow from somebody and never have to return it, what would it be? Now, I have a real story in this one, because when I was about 21, I borrowed my brother's brown belt and I still have it 20 years later. He keeps asking me about it and I keep saying, sorry, I haven't brought it this week. That's been going on for about 8 years. So I've already got something that I've borrowed and I have no intention of returning it. Nick, what do you reckon? What are you borrowing and never giving back?
Well, almost payroll related here. I've had a little bit of a think about this. You know what? I'd go back to 2010 and I would borrow a pizza. And the reason I'd borrow a pizza is back in 2010, a guy called Laszlo Hanyecz made history when he conducted the first known real-world transaction using Bitcoin, when he exchanged 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 large pizzas. This week, Bitcoin hit $107,000 per Bitcoin. So I would borrow those 2 pizzas, make that delivery. I'd become a pizza boy for a day. And I'd very happily take 10,000 Bitcoins in exchange for those 2 pizzas. And I'd be very happy, I think, in my retirement on a nice tropical island with my transactions. So there you go. A little bit of borrowing related with a pizza.
I absolutely love it. And I was going to say, do you want to swap with my old belt from my brother's? But no, there's no way you're going to do that in a million years. Chris, just to round us up.
I don't think I can beat those two. I'll start with a philosophical one and say I'd just like to borrow somebody's youth, somebody in their early 20s, because I'm not in my early 20s anymore and my hobbies involve quite a lot of physical activity and it is starting to take its toll and I'm starting to recognise that the legs aren't what they once were. But that's a very selfish one. And the other one is far more material. I'd quite like to borrow one of Tiger Woods' trophies from the early 2000s, maybe a Masters trophy or something, and never have to give that back. And I wouldn't sell it. It would take pride of place somewhere in my home.
Absolutely love that, mate. Absolutely love that. I did think about going sport related, maybe I'll borrow one of Real Madrid's many Champions Leagues and put it in the Arsenal trophy cabinet and leave it there. But we'll park that conversation for another day, probably over beer and a bit more banter going my way. Let's talk about payroll. Let's talk about building this future payroll superstar. But to set the scene, Nick, can you tell our wonderful listeners of this video a little bit about yourself and then also JGA Recruitment?
Yeah, sure. So I came out of university in 2002, found my first job with a lot of student debt in recruitment. Happened to be payroll recruitment of all things. And I've been there ever since. So going into my 23rd year now in payroll recruitment. Seeing the industry shift and change significantly during that time. When I first started picking up the phone to clients, there'd be people, back office with no windows, waiting for the complaint call to come in. I remember my first team leader saying, Nick, when they get your call and they realize you're not a complaint, it's going to open up things for you. You can have really great conversations. There's that relief moment. I've been almost addicted to the payroll industry ever since and watched it shift significantly. So 2018, having been in recruitment for some time, decided to launch the Payroll podcast, which is really about raising the profile of payroll, trying to get it to move from that back office function into, get a bit of notoriety, a little bit more recognition from stakeholders and business partners. And I've been quite passionate about trying to raise the profile of payroll ever since. The podcast has been a great vehicle for doing that. We've now got a business, JGA Recruitment. We launched in 2008 when I went on my own. It was 2 months before Lehman Brothers went under and we had the worst recession of memory. So we managed to trade through, thankfully, because we know our stuff and we've got access to a lot of great payroll talent. And here we are now. We've got a team of 26 consultants. We've got offices in the US, offices in the UK, focusing on finding the best payroll talent globally for our clients. And I think it's an important distinction to understand for those clients that you need to invest, in my opinion, if you want to get the best talent. A lot of clients are still unwilling to do so because they don't see payroll as being important enough. I'd like to think we're part of that journey of changing those perspectives. But payroll's changed significantly. Passionate about raising the profile of payroll as a result. Very lucky and fortunate enough to have been in this community now a long time and have had a couple of nice awards in the last few years in recognition, which has been great. I'm really enjoying it at the minute, but it's changing very quickly. And yeah, it's been a very kind industry for me.
And this is a really interesting point you made there, the change and the evolution of the industry. And Chris, you've been in the payroll space for many years. You and I had a conversation around how this role has evolved over time. And really, I guess, framing it in a sense that we've been running this campaign at Lace Partners around becoming skills powered. Of course, we look at it from both a HR and a payroll perspective, and it's all around organizations focusing on this skills-based approach rather than functional or traditional ways in which you would then try and find talent. So I'm going to kick off and ask you first, Chris, an overarching question, and then we'll get Nick's views. If we're talking about the evolution of payroll in terms of the skills that individuals have had from when you first started to where the industry is at the moment, what sort of differences have you seen? What are the demand skills at the moment? Let's talk about that evolution first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Nick used the phrase back office a moment ago in that overview. And I think that's a good place to start because when I started in payroll many moons ago, it was 100% a back office function. I think I walked into my first day and there was a pile of green timesheets that went into kind of an MS-DOS solution from AA Patrols, which was actually good fun to do and suited my mindset. That's probably a really good insight into the day job of a payroll person when I started. I think to varying sort of levels that has remained and it's taken a long time to sort of move away from that. There's a number of reasons for that, whether it's the difficulty in getting buy-in or getting investment into something that, if you look at it quite binary, doesn't really impact your bottom line, although, separate argument for another day as to whether it does. Therefore, the skills required were, I walked in where it was a badge of honor to have processed enough bits of paper and to be the all-encompassing person who knows absolutely everything about the UK or wherever you're working, the payroll legislation and the rules and the way the system works. And I think as time's gone on, the work itself has gone away. It's still happening with people sat processing piles of paper, but it's large minimum now. But also knowledge, as in that time the internet's become commonplace. It's just part of our daily lives. All that information is available to most people. It's not something that people just need to retain in their head. I think the skills have changed. There's a lot around change and transformation, particularly now, but that's certainly been a factor in my own career, moving away from just that day to day and being a master of all these component parts to how do we do something about this? How do we collaborate with other functions and how do we move things forward and meet the needs of our employees better? And I think it's also that helicopter view. So rather than all the effort of a payroll person or a payroll team being in getting payroll done, all of this legwork running at 100 miles an hour just to get to here's a deadline, that means everything's in for payroll. It's about trusting that, and as much of that as possible isn't needed to be done by you. Your role is governance, it's analytical. I don't really like the phrase strategic. I think it's been done to death for a long time, but it's that sort of strategic mindset and thinking, how can we do something about this? How can we change this offering now that it's automated to an extent? How can we do something that benefits employees better, that benefits the business better, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, a lot of it is mindset. It's that complete shift away from my job is to get this data, get this effort, get this manual transactional activity in to meet this deadline, to actually my job is to oversee this, and my job is to govern this and make sure that everything that's happening is happening properly, and pick up those genuine sort of issues or problems, but also take that bigger picture view.
So, Nick, from your point of view, obviously your team, you've been placing payroll people into roles for quite a long time, 2008. So from your perspective, can you just give us a bit of a flavour as to the types of conversations that you and your team have been having in terms of in-demand skills? And does some of what Chris was talking about resonate with what you hear or your team hear?
Yeah, for sure. Everything Chris said resonates. I mean, when we started, you couldn't really place a payroll professional without putting them through a manual calculations test as an example. Very few clients are demanding that kind of assessment to be done now. We still offer assessments free of charge, but demand for those assessments is less than it ever was before. And that's not to say that payroll skills aren't still in demand from a technical point of view. The role of the payroll professional has broadened significantly. It used to just be about paying people accurately, on time and compliantly. And those three pillars are still incredibly important. But I think you've got a few other pillars to bring into the mix. One of those is the human experience or employee experience, which is a part of the conversation that I don't think we were really having even 2-3 years ago. But now it's absolutely pivotal. With the rise in analytics, you've got organizational departments that aren't just payroll looking at the data and saying, you know what, we've got issues with attraction, issues with retention, whatever it might be. And we need to try and plug those gaps because it's very expensive. Recruitment can be expensive, not just to hire new talent, but to lose some of your best talent. You don't want that to happen. It can really impact a business. Put payroll in the spotlight as well, because if the payroll process is offering a great employee experience, then there's a high opportunity for employees to be attracted into that business in the first place, maybe with innovative solutions like pay on demand or dynamic compensation modeling and different things that you can provide, but also allows you to retain the staff as well. And I think that's been a really exciting shift. It's also enabled the shift from being purely technical based to more attribute led. When I talk about attributes, we never really associated in the past the importance of empathy for a payroll professional in the payroll process. And now it's really important. You've got a lot of people living paycheck to paycheck, which is a phrase often overused, but it's very much a reality. It doesn't really matter what level of earnings you've got either. You could be earning $250,000 a year. The fact is most people live within their means. They've got expensive mortgages, interest rates go up. Some of the data behind those stats say that if someone made an error on their payslip for the once in a year, they're 30% more likely to seek a new position. If you make an error in their payslip twice in a year, that jumps to 70%. That onus is on the payroll professional to get that bit right. Because if they don't, it leads to issues with staff wanting to go. There's an impact on mental health for those employees. They're worried about their bills, worried about their financial situation. There's very close links between financial health and employee wellness and mental health. I think this is a really exciting development I want to add, because it really does show the importance of payroll and the part they have to play in making sure that human experience is a really good and positive and enjoyable one for employees. And I think that's really thrust into the limelight now, the softer skills. Chris talked about transformation and change. Post-pandemic, we're seeing nearly every organization go through some form of transformation and change, whether that's systems, whether that's organizational, whether that's because they've now got a global-based workforce. We really removed the borders to employment, which has been great for us. That's why we launched in the US, because you can hire pretty much anywhere in the world. That goes back to the basics of payroll. You need that compliance expertise, you need that technical expertise, but you need a little bit more than that as well. You need to understand cultural norms, things that are acceptable, things that aren't, and how to actually initiate change for the better that's going to improve the performance of an organization. Because finally, and something I've been banging the drum for a long time, payroll's always been seen as being this really expensive department that just pays out. But if we get it right, it can be a department that actually has a huge amount of profit to the bottom line, if it can improve retention, if it can look at absence rates and see where the trends are, if it can really utilize the huge amounts of big data at its disposal to support organizational objectives, if it can look at regional pay gaps, if you've got a global workforce, it can do so much that I think now other department stakeholders, C-suites are looking at payroll with slightly different eyes and saying, you know what, we need someone who can do all the basics, but the role's more complex now. We don't just want someone with the technical skills. We need someone with the attributes, the softer skills, strong stakeholder communication skills, someone who's resilient to change, someone with good change management skills that Chris mentioned, someone that also shows empathy when there are critical moments in that payroll cycle where people need that support. A lot of talk about AI changing payroll. Actually, people are working harder than they've ever worked before in payroll. It's not that AI has made their jobs any easier. It's just way more complex. There's way more to the role of a strategic payroll professional now than there ever was before. And I think that's great. It's really raised the profile of the profession. So it's very different. It's more complex now for sure.
You've sort of started to answer my next question. So I'm going to let Kirby layer in some additional bits in there. If you're building that perfect payroll professional, you've started listing off some of the key attributes and traits and the evolution and the types of people. Kirby, anything more from your perspective, just to add in terms of this hypothetical perfect payroller? Nick mentioned a whole host of different elements focusing on the human experience from your point of view, because I know you've written a couple of pieces on that as well, haven't you, about payrolls linked to employee experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to just reiterate one of Nick's points, because I think that human experience, the employee experience, it really is a fairly new lens for payroll, having come through the ranks over a couple of decades and even in senior sort of operational roles back as only sort of 7-8 years ago. It was something you kind of subconsciously thought of, but it wasn't a thing. It wasn't necessarily on the agenda. And certainly if it was on the agenda, it was maybe HR's job. It was a pillar of HR and HR had to think about that. Some of the conversations I've had with clients even recently around payroll's role in that is ultimately, I don't know what the percentage is, but for the vast majority of employees, the only engagement they will often have with their employer is through their payslip, unless there's an issue that they need to call on HR for or a data check. Actually, it's their pay. That's why they're working. That's the engagement they have on a regular basis with their employer. You can't underestimate the importance of payroll's role in that. And I think the additional angle to that is the bits that Nick was talking about, whether you can enhance the EVP through that employee experience by offering additional services, additional support, and kind of training for employees around things like financial well-being. I think from a perfect payroller, a lot of it comes back to mindset as well as transformation change. The importance of being able to influence is another thing, right? Traditionally, payroll can be seen as quite a critical function. We've always been at the end of a chain where some things have happened, there might have been issues, there might have been problems, and it's led to something manifesting itself in our world that actually we need to then deal with, and we therefore can be quite easily seen as a critical sort of friend. The ability to influence positively and take a step back and recognize that payroll can be doing more, offering a slightly different service, a different level of support to their organization, is one thing, but being able to actually influence and get buy-in to that internally and help businesses recognize, look, this is what we could be doing and here's how we'll get there. The skills around understanding what it takes to put a business case or a value case through and make sure you're representing not just the hard numbers, but actually the value that you're bringing to the organization by shifting that mindset and focus. So I think broadly, that's all I'd really add. It supports that mindset point previously. It's a polar shift from 20 years ago. It's still a big shift from 5-6 years ago, even, to be in that state. And I think we're still on that journey.
And Nick, just to build on what Chris was talking about, from conversations you've had or just your general feel of the industry, how geared up are professionals to evolve like this? Is this something that you've naturally seen? I guess there's also a question around the role of leaders in trying to build those future skills. Can I get some thoughts about the industry as a whole? How much is it geared up to turn into these types of people, these forward-thinking payrollers?
I think payroll has always been a really adaptable profession. When they're thrown into the deep end, and don't want to always go back to the pandemic here, but they were seen as key workers. They really had to react on their feet and work all hours to get things done. But they had to be adaptable. I think there are two attributes you'd often levy against what a payroll professional offers. And I think they're going to have to adapt and evolve again. They've done it many times before. We've been through digital revolutions and changes, robotic process automation. There's all a concern about that. And actually, it's been a pretty seamless transition. The skills need to shift, and they're more than capable of making making the shift, but there is sometimes some reticence to do it. There's some fear. I'll always say potential lives on the other side of your fear. So payroll people need to lean into it more. They need to work more collaboratively with HR stakeholders, with reward stakeholders. I think back in the day, payroll people and obviously employees from a recruitment standpoint, most people would move. I'd pick up the phone to anybody and say, look, I've got a position for you. It's a 10K increase and you can't deal. And they're like, yeah, I'm in. That was what the conversation was, typically around salary. It's not anymore. People aren't always interested in the salary increase. They're saying, well, I want to have a work-life schedule that means I can work from home 3 days a week. I need to have flexibility around my childcare. I want to save for my future. So I want a particular level of pension. I want a long-term incentive plan. There's loads of different questions now that really brings payroll closer to reward, as an example. You link it to HR. We talked about earlier about retention, attraction, and some of the challenges that HR have around transformation. I think payroll need to be more open-minded to go and speak to HR and say, look, what are your challenges? What are the obstacles that you've got here? Because I think with the data I've got access to, and now my closer links to employee experience, I think I can help you with your challenges. And I think if they're the conversations that need to happen now in order to help drive where I think the profession can go in the future. It's closing that gap between the way HR is looked at and the way that reward is looked at versus how payroll is looked at. And I think if they can close that gap and bring in more collaboration between those kind of organizational departments, I think that'll really help raise the profile of payroll as well alongside it. And I think that's quite difficult for a lot because payroll typically is quite an introverted profession. Payroll people don't shout from the rooftops when they do something well. They're very happy doing what they do and getting a 99.9% accuracy rate is reward enough for a lot of payroll professionals. So it's not always in their comfort zone to go and say, you know what, we've done a great job. My recommendation would be for the leaders that want to really propel themselves is don't be afraid to be that voice. Don't be afraid to amplify what you're doing and the impact that you're having. You mentioned in the last question what are employers looking for? Kind of briefs we're taking now is employers want payroll leaders to do more with less. That's why we're seeing the adoption of AI. That's why we're seeing lots of shifts. And payroll leaders now need to come in and go, you know what, the budget's just happened. NI costs are going up for hospitality and retail organizations going to hit them significantly. So how can we do more with less? In order to do that, you've got to transform your systems and get the best out of those. You've got to look at the data and see where you can plug gaps. You've got to be more strategic. I know Chris hates that word, but they've got to be more strategic in their mindset, really, because doing what we've always done, the BAU piece, isn't going to help the profession move along. So for me, the future skills, I'd be recommending payroll people actually lift your head above the parapet and don't be afraid to collaborate. Don't be afraid to look at what you can do within your organization with the data you've got access to, with the stakeholders around you, to say, how can we help this organization make more profit from less? Where are the gaps? Where are the trends? What's ripe for transformation? Where can we advance our technology? Where can we improve the employee experience? We're seeing pay on demand as one recent innovation that's started to proliferate the payroll space in the UK. It's already well adopted in the US and other places. Interactive dashboarding, understanding what your payslip means so people can work through it, just using AI more intelligently to give a better level of service. I'm excited for the future, but that's the hardest shift. I've no doubt payroll will make the shift because they always have. They've always adapted and evolved. I think this is a bigger shift, moving into that employee experience, a little bit away from the technical side. Not saying it's not important, but as I said, the remit's got broader now, and that's not always natural for an introverted profession. So it'll be interesting to see who comes to the top.
Nick, you made some really good points there. That holistic point, it's not just payroll, is a really important one, because I think part of when I mentioned earlier around proactivity, it's about not seeing payroll as this siloed sort of end of the chain thing, which has traditionally been the case. And I think EX lends itself as a fantastic wraparound or banner for that, because if payroll are a core part of offering that employee experience as reward, as HR, as payroll, even finance, I think that is really helpful in embedding and creating that collaborative mindset and a change of approach from us being payroll and us needing to tell HR this to actually how can we help each other and being proactive around that. I think the other point you made there around the importance of a leader shouting about how payroll can support, can help, I think that comes back to the point around actually the ability to influence, because quite often with the way that payrolls are set up now, with the investment that they've had up to now, quite often when you do lift the lid on that, the answer is quite difficult. The answer is actually we can't do this now. It might be because we've got 7 different T&A systems, we've got 20 different payroll providers, we've got teams scattered all around the world, and actually the effort to do it feels insurmountable. And I think that's where that ability to influence organizations internally and turn that on its head and say, look, this is where we want to get to. We could be offering this, but look what we're working with. Yes, there's an investment needed to get to the point where we can offer this, but this is the carrot on the end of the stick. And it's that understanding, I think, that helps to not only progress payroll, but just build that future vision for payroll.
But it's not easy. If you think about the background for payroll, historically, it's been underinvested, which you mentioned that earlier, Chris, dealing with complaints, the fall guy for many things that go wrong. You see a front page news and it goes wrong. There has been, the department that's been undervalued and underrespected in many regards. As a result, they've siloed down. They don't necessarily want to collaborate because they've been dealing with this as an industry for an awful long time. So you've got to break out of that silo and be more collaborative. From the leadership perspective, that involves more of a coaching mindset. And if you're coaching your own teams or whether you're working with other stakeholders, it's not saying, what can you do for me, which is typically what we often do because I'm underinvested, I need money. It's actually saying, what are your challenges in HR? How can I use what I've got at my disposal to support you more? Doing the same with finance, doing the same with IT, doing the same with reward and so on, and getting the buy-in from those functions. Because if you can solve some of their problems first, that will really help get their buy-in later when you want to invest in your own function. But to give them some defense here, it's not easy because it's been a function that's been hit pretty hard with negatives, and what they do is pay out, and it's not skilled enough for us, and it's not chartered now, but it wasn't in the past. I think they've had a pretty bad press and a rough time. So it's just breaking out of what's gone before and almost starting anew now and go, you know what, we are now a chartered profession. We are now valued. We got the organizations through the pandemic. We've been recognized at senior political levels with the Australian Prime Minister coming out and talking publicly about the role that payroll professionals played in the pandemic and more. That actually now's the time to go, let's start afresh. Let's start the collaboration piece. Let's really utilize the things that are happening in the world, like pay transparency, like gender pay gapping, like potentially the ethnicity pay gap. These are all things that are going to impact the payroll cycle and the payroll process. And everyone is an opportunity to raise the profile further. So it's grabbing that now and starting again. That'd be my recommendation to the leaders.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. It's a really good kind of bookend towards the podcast because we're just reaching towards the end today. Some really interesting stuff that you guys have both picked out there around mindset, around opportunity, around the evolution of the role and how that opportunity means that some payroll people might have to step out of their comfort zone, like Nick, you were talking about, sometimes just happy of getting it 99.9% right and stuff, and certain types of traits there. Really interesting. There's a great opportunity coming on the horizon, and hopefully I think we can certainly chew the fat maybe in a year's time and have a look to see what's been happening in the space. Nick, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been amazing to get you on.
I've enjoyed it. It's been great.
He's absolutely beaten us, Chris Kirby, with that fundamentally different question, didn't he? That Bitcoin pizza bit. It just blew me.
Gave you a bit of time to think about it. You went first. It was all right.
I wish I'd gone first.
Chris, thank you very much for joining me again as well.
No worries. Very enjoyed. Thanks, Chris.
You can get access to all of our content in the payroll space. If you go onto Lace Partners website and go to lacepartners.co.uk/insight, you can find, there's also a tab that you can just click and filter down on all of the different payroll blogs, podcasts and video content. Some stuff we talked about previously that links to this. We had Anna Lau on last year. She's a director of payroll at PPHE Group, and she was talking about raising the brand of payroll. And that's something that resonates with this as well. But from myself, from Nick and Chris, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.